Welcome. Today's lesson is about angles, lines that form angles, how we represent or refer to the angles, and then we're going to talk about congruent angles, complementary angles, supplementary angles, vertical angles, and adjacent angles. The first thing, let's talk about how we write about angles or we designate them. Here I have two lines that intersect, forms four distinct angles, an angle on top, angle on bottom, and an angle on the left side and the right side. Now, in order to talk about them mathematically or put them into an expression or an equation, we designate an angle with it looks like almost a less than symbol, but it's not. It's a angle symbol where you have a line coming down, and then this should be horizontal, an angle. And then what's important is you need three letters to represent the angle. One of the letters, one of the first letters you write has to be a point on the two sides of the angle. So if we look at this top angle here, if we come down like this and turn and come up like that, so we're looking at this angle here, I either have to start with the C and say I have a vertex at E, and then I go through B. So that's why I have this angle CEB. But there would be nothing wrong with me doing it the other direction and going from B to a vertex E and out through C. So either of those are a fine way to represent this top angle. The thing is, you cannot put the E on the edges. I can't do angle ECB. That would be incorrect because that means I come up this way and then I come out like this, and I'm actually talking that angle, but there's no line up there. So make sure that you put the angle inside the letter of the vertex in the middle of the two values. All right, let's see if I can get rid of some of this now. All right, now that I erased that, the thing I want to emphasize is let's talk about first what it means to be congruent angles. Hopefully that one's pretty straightforward. You've heard that many times. Congruent just means they have the same measure. Has nothing to do with the lines intersect or anything. If I have an angle here that's say 30 degrees, and I have an angle somewhere else down here, and it's also 30 degrees, those two angles would be congruent. And any other angle that has a 30-degree measure would be congruent to the 30-degree angles. So congruent just means they have the same measure. Complementary angles always are two angles, always two, not three or four or more. It's always two angles whose measures add up to 90. So this 30-degree angle here, if I had another angle somewhere else that happened to be 60 degrees, then these two angles would be considered complementary because they add up to 90. They don't have to be touching, they don't have to be by each other, just the two measures have to add up to 90. Now, a lot of times what you'll see is you'll see a right angle. That was horribly right, but a right angle, and then what they do is they cut that right angle into two smaller angles, and so technically these two angles here, this one on the bottom and this one on top, would be considered complementary because they add up to 90 and they are next to each other. But I just want to say complementary don't have to be next to each other. Now let's talk about supplementary angles. Supplementary are two angles whose measures add up to 180 degrees. So let's say if this one was 140 degrees, and then we'd have to have some other angle somewhere else that has a measure of 40 degrees, and that 40-degree angle and this 140-degree angle, those two would be considered supplementary because they add up to 180. They don't have to be next to each other, they don't have to touch, but they just have those two, again, not three or four, but only two angles, and their measures add up to 180. Now again, a lot of times they'll have a straight line, and they'll cut the line, they'll have another ray come off like that. Those two angles here are considered supplementary because this angle plus this angle here is a straight line or adds up to 180. So those two are supplementary. So oftentimes you will see supplementary that are put together that form a line, or they're actually called adjacent. Let's talk about, we'll talk about adjacent in just a minute. Let's first talk about the vertical angles. The vertical angles have to be touching tip to tip. And vertical angles, when you have two lines that intersect, like the two lines I'm showing here already, This angle here is considered to be a vertical angle to this one. So vertical doesn't mean up and down necessarily when it comes to angles. Vertical means they're across from each other, or they're pointing at each other, tip to tip. Now there happens to be another set of vertical angles in this diagram, because this top one here happens to also be vertical to this one down here, but they're not vertical to the blues. So the reds are vertical to the red, the blues vertical to the blue, but not a red to a blue. Again, they're pointing at each other, tip to tip. You can think of them as arrows. Vertical angles point right at each other if you're thinking that as an arrow. So vertical angles have to be tip to tip. If I have an angle here and I have another angle over here like this, that they almost look like they're vertical, but they're not, because they're not touching. They don't have that vertex that's in common. And the last thing we want to talk about are adjacent angles. Adjacent angles have to have the same vertex. So in other words, if this is one angle here, the other angle has to have its vertex right there. So I'm going to draw a red angle here. It has to come off from here. And the thing is, it has to share one side in common, so that its side's going to go right along this one like this. So here's the red angle. Here's the blue angle. Those are considered adjacent because they have the same vertex. They go to the same exact point, but they are next to each other, but not overlapping. What I mean by overlapping, I'll see if I can show you what that means really quickly. Here's one angle. Now I'm going to draw a red angle on top of that where it shares the same vertex. It's going to share this top side in common. That was supposed to be right on top, but then it comes in like this. So this angle here is on the inside or in part of the blue angle here. Those are not vertical angles. Vertical angles do not overlap. They have to share a side, and one has to go off in one direction and the other one goes off in the other direction. And they have that vertex in common right there at the center. Those are called adjacent angles. I hope I didn't say vertical, but those are adjacent angles. Now, in your assignment, you're going to be given diagrams that have lines that intersect kind of like this. Now, this line here is perpendicular to this one. They didn't draw the little right angle in there, but I want to draw it. So they'll ask you many, many types of questions. Questions such as, which angle happens to be, trying to move this, come here. They might ask you, which angle is adjacent, or list one angle that's adjacent to this angle here, to angle BED. Well, there's only two angles that are adjacent to it. Well, there's actually more angles, but this one would be considered adjacent, and this one would be considered adjacent, because the one on the above shares this side in common and goes off to the left. The one down here shares this side in common and goes off to the right or down below. So those would be considered adjacent. It might ask you, what angle is complementary to BED? So I need an angle that when I add it to the measure of BED is 90. Well, I don't know what the measure of BED is, but I do know that this angle and this angle together add up to 90 because that's a right angle. So I would say that this angle here is complementary to BED because those two angles form a right angle. It might also ask you, what angle is supplementary to angle BED? Well, the angle that's supplementary would be either this angle that comes in like this and goes up like this, because that angle here and this angle here form a line or add up to 180. We could actually even include the one down here, the one that comes off like this. This angle here is supplementary. So there's actually happens to be two supplementary angles, because this one here, again, I'm getting too many colors in here, but this one here and the BED form that line through A and B. Or if I wanted to, I could do the one up here, the angle that comes down through C, turns at E and goes up through B, and then angle BED that comes off like this, and it forms that line. And so those two are supplementary. So hopefully this is enough that you can do some of your homework. If you have any questions, please do bring them to class.